Okay, hello. We're going to be talking about constraints development today, and I'm just going to pull out three areas which will be, we call them more difficult areas of the constraints. There are a lot of other ones as well. You can see my other video for those if you want to. So we're going to talk about savings gaps, primary product dependency, and the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. And I've just noticed that quite a lot of people struggle with describing a lot of these. That's why we're doing it. So first thing, savings gaps. Savings gaps, this is a cycle. It's often termed as the poverty cycle. And we start off this cycle with low incomes. We have low incomes because we probably have low MRP for this worker. Their marginal physical product is likely to be low because they are likely to not have very much capital because there's not been much investment. Their marginal revenue, part of the marginal revenue product, is likely to be low because they're selling their goods at a low price. So low price plus low productivity is going to result in low incomes. Low incomes mean that you're going to have low savings. You're going to have a high marginal propensity to consume, and you're going to have a low marginal propensity to save. Most of your income will go on necessities. If that's the case, there are no or very, very little injections into banks. I shouldn't use the word injection. It's a withdrawal from the circular flow, and it flows into banks, into the financial system. The financial system would take that, if it had it, and lend to businesses who would hopefully invest. And with that investment, you would see LRES shifting right. You would see incomes rising. And when we were just talking about this MRP, the marginal physical product of workers would increase because you are combining your work with capital. So for example, for the farmer, you have low incomes because you don't have a tractor and you're selling very low level goods. That means low amounts of money into the bank. The bank then cannot fund, for example, diversification away from farming, perhaps into manufacturing. So your cocoa farmer could make chocolate, for example. That would require capital. Also, you cannot get more efficient because you haven't got the tractor to become more efficient. And so that low investment results in low growth, which then comes back to the low incomes and low savings. So it is cyclical. Another point to make here is that the financial sector, which links the two together, the savers and the firms together, that may not exist. So rather than just low lending, it might actually be that we don't even have a functioning financial sector at all. So two reasons there for why those savings don't flow to companies and we don't get, I suppose you would say, external growth. To evaluate, you could use the Harrod-Domar model. Now that uses two things which are slightly confusing. Savings ratio, the proportion of income saved. You want that to be high. High is good. So I want a high number there. The capital output ratio, the amount of capital needed for a given amount of output. Now that's slightly more difficult. You want this one to be low. If you are efficient, you can use a small amount of capital to create a large amount of output. And that would be, so that's the low amount of capital. And that would be true if you had skilled workers who knew how to use the capital. You had an infrastructure, you had electricity, you had a good road network and broadband and all those things, which allowed you to use capital efficiently. And that would result in a low capital output ratio. And in developing countries, that's likely not to be true. The capital output ratio in developing countries is likely to be high. You have poor infrastructure, your electricity cuts out, so your machines cannot work all the time. You've got low skilled workers, and they may not be able to operate the capital effectively. You get mistakes and so on and so forth. So economic growth will be high when the savings ratio is high and the capital output ratio is low. That results in high growth. That would likely happen in a developed country where you have that sort of scenario. If you have a low savings ratio over a high capital output ratio, that means low growth. And that low growth would happen in developing countries where you had, for all the reasons I just mentioned, would contribute to that happening. And so again, you can see that being cyclical. Why is it evaluation? Well, it's not only the savings ratio, which is a factor in your growth, it's also the capital output ratio. So you could actually have a low savings ratio, but if your capital output ratio were high, then that would outweigh or might outweigh that factor. Okay, so there are actually two factors. It's not just the savings ratio. It's all very well to have savings, but it depends on what you do with them. And if you have lots of savings and they're not lent out by banks to fund useful capital investment, then again, that's not going to result in a lot of economic growth and therefore development. Secondly, savings are not the only inflow into banks. We could replace or fill savings gaps with aid. We could fill it with FDI, particularly, or exports. All of those things would create injections into the circular flow, and that might enable extra lending to take place. And finally, in a lot of countries now, we have new technology, which means that for the financial sectors, you may not have physical banks, but you might have virtual banks. I believe M-Pesa is a really good example of that. Banking on mobile phones, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, is really allowing money to flow through to firms. And that might mean that you get more investment and therefore more growth and development. Okay, primary product dependency, a real issue. Two real answers to this. The Previous Singer is kind of the same sort of issue, really. So it's one and the same thing. There are a number of countries who have very, very high proportion of their exports. I'll leave you to see that yourself, but it's often things like coffee, things like cocoa, minerals, things like that. That has two problems. Firstly, you have price volatility. Now, it's likely that you are a price taker in world markets, and we know that the weather often affects these things, and the PED for your good is likely to be highly elastic. Both of those things mean that you're likely to see large shifts in supply, which results in large changes to your price. And world market prices for coffee or cocoa are very volatile, which means that you don't know what you're going to make next year, and that means that investment is very difficult. And you would struggle to borrow money. Obviously, we've got a savings gap, but you wouldn't know whether you could repay your loan next year if you wanted to invest in a new tractor, because you wouldn't know what your income would be. Likewise, low profits as well. You are in there's lots of close substitutes to your good if you're making a primary product. And therefore, the low profits would also mean it's likely that you're going to have low levels of profit, low levels of investment. Your retained profits cannot fund that investment, and that investment would be needed for high profits. So you can see the catch-22 situation we're in here. The low profits lead to low profits. The price volatility leads to price volatility. The savings gaps lead to further savings gaps, and they are all cyclical in nature. Finally, the Prebisch Singer. This is very often confused. You would not know the number of times where people try to write about PED when you're supposed to be writing about YED. So it's important to get that right. So we know that, firstly, the YED is the percentage change in QD divided by the percentage change in income. We're talking about income and not price of the good. Developing countries, first of all, as we just said, are specialized in primary products, and we've got some examples above. The difficult starting point is as the world income rises. So let's assume that the world's growing, it generally is, and we know that the demand for primary products rises at a slower rate than the demand for manufactured goods and services. So as I get richer, I would tend to, first of all, if I'm very poor, I demand more primary products because I'm hungry. But that gets satiated, that gets met, I get full. There's only so many potatoes I can eat, there's only so much coffee I can drink. And so there's a limit to how much I am going to demand. Once I get to the next stage, I'm full enough, I've got the necessities, but then I want a TV, I want some electronic goods, I want a car. But there's only so many electronic goods and cars and phones that you can buy before you start to run out and be satiated. And after that, we move into services, holidays, experiences, finance, education. And these areas are far more, it's far less limited. You can spend all you like on services, really, and very rich people find lots of things to spend their money on, even if they have all the manufactured goods that they require. So going back to all of this, countries specialised in primary products grow at a lower rate than developed countries, because places like the US, as they get richer, they don't demand very much more coffee or cocoa, so on, but they do demand a lot more education, a lot more finance, and a lot more foreign holidays. So we could say that developing countries' terms of trade deteriorates over time. Remember that it's the index of average export prices over the index of average import prices. So we're saying that over time, your import prices are rising faster than your export prices. Why? Well, the demand for your exports as a primary producer, say the demand for your cocoa, is growing slowly, so the price rises slowly over time. But the demand for, capital, which you need to import, machines, is rising quickly. So the price of those goods rises more quickly. And over time, you are going to have to sell a greater number of exports, greater amount of cocoa, to buy the same amount of capital. And we can see that in those 2 points there. Importing capital becomes more challenging, and that creates a barrier to diversification. And we also know that we could put this in a different way, that developing countries' share of global income over time will be falling. They may be growing, but they're growing at a lower rate than rich countries. And so a greater proportion of the whole economic pie, if you like, is going to rich countries. If poor countries want to access the technology that rich countries are making and the capital that they are, then they're going to really struggle. They're going to get left behind. And I'll just leave you to think about that table there. Just pause it, try and fill out the table with reference to the question, and then try and add an AD curve onto each of those diagrams. Okay, coming back, we would know that if the YED is 5 for UK education, that means it's very responsive, it's an elastic YED good, and it's a luxury, I suppose you could say. Then the percentage change, given it's a 10% change there, it would be 5 times 10, it would give you a 50% increase in exports for the UK. If China just produced electronics, they would have a 20%. That's still income elastic, but less elastic than the UK's education services. And likewise for Ghana, they would have a 5% increase in the change of exports, assuming that they only export cocoa beans, because they have an inelastic YED, suggesting that that is a necessity, inelastic normal good. All of those are normal goods. And all of those countries are growing, but it's just that the UK is growing faster than the other countries there. In that case then, in Ghana, you would see the AD curve shifting very marginally over time, because we have little growth. We have income inelastic good, so growth is limited. In China, you would see a relatively bigger shift in AD, and in the UK, you would see a much bigger shift. You would see a much bigger shift in AD, as you can see there. Okay, so you can argue, therefore, that the growth of developed countries who are specialised in these income elastic goods is going to be higher, therefore they grow more, and this therefore is a constraint to development for Ghana. How could we evaluate this? I've got 40 seconds left. How can I evaluate? I could evaluate by using the YED of primary products. Some primary products like oil, for example for Nigeria, or copper for Chile, are YED elastic. Copper is used in electronics, that's a luxury good, or can be more of a luxury good, and oil is fundamental to all production processes, therefore they're YED elastic, and therefore as world income grows, these countries will be growing quite fast. Secondly, if you go into a recession, the opposite is true, and these rich countries will go into a much bigger recession with a YED elastic good than the poor countries. Okay, hope that made some more sense. Thanks for watching.